Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about Mr. Rogers. This past Saturday, March 20th, was Mr. Rogers Day, a new holiday on the calendar, at least on the Presbyterian planning calendar. It's March 20th in honor of Mr. Rogers' birthday. You might have noticed over the last several years that a lot has been made about Mr. Rogers. There was a documentary, there was the Tom Hanks film, several books have been written, and maybe you were even able to take my class on The Peaceful Neighbor about Mr. Rogers. The subtitle being Discovering the Countercultural Mr. Rogers. What's more countercultural than taking off your dress shoes to put on loafers and a sweater around the house with a tie still on? I've thought a lot about Mr. Rogers, not just in this past weekend, but he's been an example for me. Whenever I first started at Allen Congregational Church, I was the newly appointed Director of Christian Education, which was focused largely on Sunday school for children. I thought, well, I'm Presbyterian, I'm working with children. What would be a good Presbyterian example of people who've worked with children? And so I started studying Mr. Rogers. I'd seen the show as a child, but as an adult, thinking about what he sought to share with kids and their parents was something I wouldn't have picked up on just by watching his show as a youngster. There's a lot to Mr. Rogers that I think is worth knowing. He was in fact ordained to his television show, making something of a strange pulpit. He was deeply influential not just in the world of children's television, but in the culture, that we can give Mr. Rogers credit for things like the VCR and public broadcasting television. And so, if you like Mr. Rogers, or if you enjoy these musings, I hope you'd stick around for a little bit longer so I can talk about a hero, a TV neighbor of mine. Mr. Rogers, Freddie, grew up in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. His father was rather well-to-do. He owned a die casting factory, and he was basically an industrialist in the Pennsylvania area. Freddie grew up in one of the largest houses in Latrobe. But Freddie had a rough childhood. The neighborhood kids would call him Fat Freddie. He was sickly often, and so he would spend an awful lot of time in his house playing the piano and playing with puppets. Two things that would serve him well in his future television show. And I think that's one of the interesting things to me about Mr. Rogers. What makes him so powerful when speaking with children? Well, I think that as an adult, he's intimately connected to the experiences of his own childhood. He didn't forget what it was like to be picked on. He didn't forget what it was like to be angry or mad, to be jealous about a friend or a sibling. And so he's able to connect with children even while talking about how we manage our feelings. Something that he's made fun of, but also something that he's especially good at. What's mentionable is manageable, he said to a senator when advocating for the funding of public television. How we learn to acknowledge our feelings, even our anger or our jealousy, and to process them aloud with others is one of the things that helps us to channel our feelings into creative and helpful action. So, because of his childhood, he's able to remember quite a bit and bring it to his television show. There was one day that he was being chased by a group of boys who were taunting him, and he ran to a neighbor's house. That neighbor was someone who became a mainstay of Fred's life. And one of the stories that Amy Hollingsworth tells in her book, The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers, is that over time, this neighbor created what Fred called his favorite after-school snack. It is not an especially special snack. They were toast sticks. She would toast bread, cut them into slices, and put jelly on them. So, toast and jam after school. But one day, the neighbor helped Fred to make them all on his own. And that was a memory that stuck with Mr. Rogers. His favorite snack he could now make himself. We can help other people to grow and to learn. So, what would be the toast sticks that Fred gives to us? What are the things that we can learn to do for ourselves so that we know that we are growing and capable people, either in the life of faith or in life in general? One thing I've already said is that Fred teaches us that what is mentionable is manageable. That so often we spend so much physical and emotional energy, so much stress on trying to keep our thoughts and our feelings to ourselves. Learning how to mention them is something that's really powerful for children and for adults, which is why his show was not always simple. He was able to mention things like divorce, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. His first week on the air in 1968 was about the Vietnam War. Among other things, I think there were balloons also, and I think that King Friday was worried about the balloons that were coming in, thinking that they were bombs when in fact they were messages of peace. That was the first week of the show. How we're able to mention things, to summon the courage in ourselves to process what we feel and to speak it to others. I'm upset. I'm unhappy. I don't feel wanted. These are the things that Rogers teaches his TV neighbors to do. Within the life of the church, one of the reasons I chose this book for my very first class at Woods is that Rogers was in some ways countercultural. He encouraged conversations, even among children, about difficult subjects. Rogers himself was a pacifist, a vegetarian, someone committed to egalitarian principles between men and women, even in the early 60s. He hired several, he hired at least some openly LGBT people on his staff, even though Francois Clemens, Officer Clemens in the show, someone who sang often in the operas, pushed Fred to be able to come out on the show, and Fred turned that down. Nonetheless, Fred knew. He even told Francois that perhaps he should try dressing up like a lady to see if that would help him with his feelings. So here we have a children's television host who's in touch with things that are going on in the society around him. But they weren't just cultural issues to Rogers. Every one of them was personal. From the people I know and have met who knew the Rogers family personally, I've only ever heard that Rogers was off-screen exactly who you might imagine him to be on screen. That he was kind and sweater wearing. How do we understand someone with such remarkable calm, such remarkable poise, someone who was always ready to tell people just how special they were? What I like is that, for my money, Rogers was able to do on a television show what pastors often fail to do even in the pulpit. Rogers was, as I said, ordained to his television show. The Presbyterian Church was convinced that who Rogers was and what he sought to do with the show somehow would spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. But there were only a couple of times whenever Bible verses were ever mentioned. The name Jesus didn't come up all that often, although one time he did show a Greek New Testament without ever showing that it was in fact a New Testament. There was a flash that they shall turn their swords into plowshares during that week on war. So what was it about Rogers' message that helped it align with the gospel message? How do we understand the ministry of his television show? And does that teach us anything about the ministries that we are able to do when we're not standing behind a pulpit, which even I don't do all that often? Rogers was convinced in his own theology, as he sang in one of his songs that I am particularly fond of, that I like you as you are, exactly and precisely. I think you've turned out nicely, and I like you as you are. That wasn't just Rogers speaking. That was the way he understood God to think. That everybody's special, everybody's fine. You are fancy, and so am I. That in each and every one of us, we have the inner light of God, the image of God that we bear, but we bear them in especially unique, that's redundant, especially unique ways. So to look at people to find how they express the image of God in unique ways is a holy task. To fail to see that image in each and every person that you meet is a theological failure. And so Rogers tries to communicate to people that they can see God within themselves too, that they are loved, that they are cared for, and they have at least one TV neighbor that is happy to have a neighbor like you. So right now, during Lent, we've been doing a community engagement seminar with the Center in Baltimore. How do we engage our neighbors? Part of me thinks that if we were all like Mr. Rogers, that wouldn't be a question that's up in the air for us. Knowing the people who live around us, whoever they may be, and learning to like them just the way they are, without needing to change them, but helping them to grow, well, that's the work of a good neighbor. That's the work of Fred Rogers. And as Fred has it, that's the work that Jesus does too. So you may not have known that this past Saturday was Mr. Rogers' Day. And even today, I don't have on a sweater and blue slippers, even though I happen to own some. But for me, I hope for you this week, you can imagine what were the feelings of your childhood? Who were the people that helped you to grow into the person that you are now? How did people communicate to you that you were special, just the way you are? How do you communicate that to your coworkers, your family, to the people that are around you, even literally in your neighborhood? How do you look for the image of God in them? And how do you find those small countercultural areas where you can think deeply and communicate them clearly? Because Mr. Rogers had a television show, he didn't have to answer the most difficult questions about whether or not to be in Vietnam or not be in Vietnam. His lesson to children is that war is not nice. How do we take the simple premises that we might understand from Scripture, that generally we are supposed to be nice and war doesn't seem very nice? How can we dive deeper than Rogers was able to do in his television show to understand our core principles, the things that we stand by, and be able to mention them out loud with others? That's the work that neighbors do. When they share time with one another, they open their houses to one another, and they tell one another just how much the visitors in their neighborhood mean. I could talk about Mr. Rogers for days. I probably will have future classes on Mr. Rogers, I am sure. This was the first Mr. Rogers Day officially, at least according to the Presbyterian calendar. So mark March 20th for 2022. I wonder what ways you can think like Mr. Rogers and serve your neighbors just like Mr. Rogers did. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. I'll see you next Monday.